And this is example 14. Evaluate the expression. So to evaluate this expression, we can remember the memory device. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. And remember that multiplication and division and addition subtraction are a single step. So I sometimes circle the letters or underline them just to remind me that there's 4 steps, not 6. And we go to the first step, which is parentheses. And so I hone in on these parentheses, and I see that I have a -7 plus 4. I am going to show you this with a calculator in a second, but I want to remind you of the rules for adding sign numbers. If we have a -7 and a +4, it says to add numbers, add sign numbers, if they have the same sign. Well, they don't have the same sign, so we'll move on to the next rule. If they have different signs, subtract the magnitudes. That's just a fancy way to say ignore the signs. And 7 minus 4 is 3. Does everybody see 7 minus 4 is 3? Because the signs were different, we subtracted the values. And you keep the sign of the larger number. And so let me go ahead and do that. So I'm not doing any of the other stuff yet. I subtracted, because they were different signs, I subtracted the numbers. 7 minus 4 is 3. And I keep the sign of the larger number, which was the negative, so -3. If I was to compare this to real life, this would be like you going to your mailbox today, and you have a Visa bill of $7. And I realize these numbers are small compared to the real world, but the concept's the same. So you have a Visa bill of $7 and a paycheck of $4. If you have a bill of 7 and a paycheck of 4, because they have opposite signs, your bills and your paychecks, they eat away at each other. And in this case, my Visa bill was more, and so the $4 of pay did its best to whittle that down to a -3. So that's why that rule works, if that kind of makes sense. The rules do make sense in real life, but they're sometimes too much to think about all at once, so you just memorize. If you're adding 2 numbers with different signs, you keep the sign of the larger and subtract. Okay? And now we're done with parentheses. Though we technically have parentheses still there, there's nothing to do inside them, so we can move on to the exponent step. So it doesn't matter where that exponent occurs, we want to work on that next, and we have to square this. And what we said, when you square a negative times a negative is a positive, and 3 squared is 9, so this is going to give me a +9. Now normally if I write +9, I wouldn't write the plus, but because we had to think about it, I wanted to make sure that I wrote it down. The negative to the second power, a negative times a negative is a positive. And 3 times 3, this means 3 times itself 2 times, so 3 times 3 is 9. And the -15, I'm not on that step. So that was my exponent step. I move on to step 3, which is multiplications, divisions. So I'm going to move down the line, and I don't have any multiplications or divisions. So I'm now ready to move on to the addition subtraction step. Now how you handle this, you've got some options. My favorite way is to simply do the subtraction and realize that since you're subtracting more than you started with, you're going to get a negative. And so 9 minus 15 is -6. There will be several ways for you to think about that. One of the nice ones is if you just type 9 minus 15 on your calculator, it knows it's -6. But let me just give some everyday life examples. If I have $9 in my checkbook and I try to subtract, I write a check for $15, it's going to bounce by $6. I'm $6 short to be able to write that check. Or if it's 9 degrees outside, it's 9 degrees above 0, and it gets 15 degrees colder, we subtract 15 degrees, we're going to be at 6 below. Okay? I also want to talk about calculator. So I can cover up PEMDAS because the calculator knows PEMDAS. It doesn't need to refer back to it. And so let's take a look at typing this one in. For the sake of those of you who were not here last time, we introduced a new button. And so let's take a look at these before I get started. We have a subtraction button It's not showing up very well. Let me switch pen colors here. So we have a subtraction button that comes in the list of, divide, multiply, subtract. And that we use when we're subtracting. But if we're trying to get a negative number, we use this little button down here. Does everybody see where I'm pointing? Right at near the bottom of the screen, there's a negative button. And so let's go ahead and type this in as we see it. I'm going to zoom out to try to capture more of the calculator's display. And hopefully you can see, especially what I'm typing. So I'm going to hit clear. It's always a good way to start. And I'm going to ignore all the work I did. I'm just going to let the calculator do all the work this time. I'm going to open parentheses. To type -7, do not hit your subtract button. If you want -7, you hit -7. Okay, and unfortunately the display is not showing perfectly. I'll move it when I'm done so you can see it. +4, close parentheses, squared. Okay, and before I get much further, let me try to see if we can get that to show up in the display better. So far so good. That's the expression that we're typing. And now I'm going to finish it up with a subtraction. Now, this negative over here was -7, but this is like a verb. This is telling me to subtract 15. So I have to hit the -15 equals. And it gives me the -6, the same -6 that we had calculated by hand. Please practice these both ways, especially the ones that you can have the explanations showing, which are any of the ones in our notebook, are either explained in the book or explained. They're either in our notebook or they're in one of the videos, and sometimes both. Okay. Any questions with that? So that one is -6. Question 15. Once again, we're going to talk about PEMDAS. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. And at first, you might say we don't have any parentheses because the only parentheses we see, there's nothing to do inside that parentheses, and there's nothing to do inside this parentheses. So you might say, oh, we can move on to the exponent step, but not exactly. When you have a fraction, even though they don't physically put parentheses around the top and the bottom, I'm going to draw them. You don't have to, but I'm going to draw parentheses around the top and around the bottom. And then I'm going to remind you on your calculator, this fraction bar, depending on the context and how it tells you to leave your answer, you can either use your ABC button or you can use your division button. So you can use your fraction button or your division button, but we'll hold off on that for now. I am about to give you a strong recommendation that works every time, but it's not always the fastest way, and here's what I'm going to suggest. Treat the top as its own problem until you have it down to one number, just a single answer, and do the same with the bottom. Treat them separately, and that's what I'm going to do. And so I'm going to put an equal sign, and I'm going to draw a fraction bar, and I'm going to go through PEMDAS on the top and pretend the bottom doesn't exist. So here goes. PEMDAS up top, parentheses. There are none really. I mean, there's this set, but there's nothing inside it we can do. So we'd move on to exponents. There's no exponents up top. So I move on to multiplication, division. And as I come down the line, this is 81 plus the -36 divided by 6. So I can do this division. And so this is where it gets a little tricky. It's 81 plus. I'm skipping that for now. And this division is -36 divided by 6. And let me go back to the rules we have. Let's see. Actually, it'd be easier for me to put it above. The rule for multiplication and division of signed numbers. And I know this is a little tricky to see, but if you've got signed numbers, which is what we have a negative and a positive, it tells us what to do if the signs are different. It says just perform the operation. So we're just going to divide the old-fashioned way. You could use your calculator, but a lot of you know this one. 36 divided by 6 is 6. And the result, because these two had different signs, one was negative, one was positive, if they're different, the result is negative. So this is 81 plus, and then this result is negative 36. And I'm going to write the negative up a little higher so it's easier to see, or you could put it in parentheses if you wanted to. Oh, not 36. I'm sorry. I don't have any white out, so this is just 6. We already did the division. Sorry about that. So negative 6. Okay. And now I'm going to let the bottom just go for now. I'm going to come back to it later. So just leave room to do it, and then leave yourself enough space when you come down to be able to fit that in later. But we're going to do the 81 plus the negative 6. 81 plus the negative 6, we have to use our rules for addition. Our rule for addition says if they have a different sign, then you subtract their magnitudes. 81 minus a 6 is 75. And don't panic if you would have preferred to use a calculator for that. So that's a 75. And you take the sign of the larger. So 81 is positive. It beats out the negative 6. This would be like you go to your mailbox and you have a paycheck for $81 and a Visa bill for $6. You'd be able to take your $81, pay off the $6, and have 75 left over. Again, this work I'm going to show us how to have our calculator help us out for now. So don't be intimidated if we're doing some of this in our head right at the moment. Now, technically, I kind of skipped from the division step to the addition subtraction step without mentioning that I got there. But notice after you did this division and had the negative 6, all that was left was this addition. So when there's one thing left, I don't always look back at PEMDAS to see what I do next, because if there's one thing left, you do it. Okay, 75 is on top. Now, as I said before, you treat the denominator like it's its own order of operations. And so I start from scratch. P stands for parentheses, and note technically we have a parentheses right here. There's nothing to do inside there. It's already a negative 5. So I'm going to look for exponents. There's no exponents on the bottom. So I'm going to look for multiplications and divisions. On the bottom, notice this 4 is in front of parentheses, so there's a multiplication here. And there's a subtraction. So multiplication takes precedence over subtraction. This step with multiplication comes before the step with subtraction. And so I'm going to do 4 times negative 5. And here's where we looked at those rules a second ago. Let's see if that fits up there. If you're multiplying or dividing, and we're multiplying 4 times negative 5, if the signs are different, you get a negative. So 4 times negative 5 is going to be negative 20. Okay, 4 times negative 5. 4 times 5 is 20. A positive times a negative is different, and the rule says if they're different, the result is negative. Okay, and then finally we have this minus 5 that I'm just going to write down because we're not on that step yet. Okay, and now we have to do negative 20 minus 5. You can use your calculator to help, but for now I want to talk about doing this one without the calculator. If it's minus 20 outside and it gets 5 degrees colder, then you're going to be at minus 25. Okay, there's different ways to go about getting to this point, and we'll talk more of them as we look at signed numbers. But one of my favorite ways to think about it, like if I owe $20 and then I try to spend 5 more, let's say my Visa bill's already at negative 20 and I spend 5, I subtract $5 more by spending $5 more, my Visa bill would be at negative 25. Okay? If you missed when I said it, I was giving a suggestion. When we started this question, there were no parentheses around the top and the bottom. I put them there as a reminder that when you have a fraction, the top and the bottom act as if there's parentheses around them. This becomes one group, and this becomes another group. And so notice I treated them as if they were 2 separate problems. Until now, we're at the very end, and now we can do this last step. You need to read the directions carefully. This question doesn't come, it just says evaluate, and so it doesn't come with directions of how to finish it off. So sometimes they tell you to leave your answers as a fraction. Sometimes they say decimals are okay. This one, since it doesn't say, I'm going to treat it as a division, and it actually works out pretty well because 75 divided by 25 is 3, and I'm going to think about the signs in a second. If you had 75 cents, wouldn't that be like 3/4? When you have, like, if you had three quarters, you'd have 75 cents. So 75 divided by 25 is 3. If you don't want to do that in your head, there's no reason you need to. I'm just going to do this first sweep through without the calculator. Now, is this a positive 3 or a negative 3? And again, we have rules up here for multiplication and division of signed numbers. The rules are the same for multiplication and division with signed numbers. If they're the same, you get a positive. If they're different, you get a negative. So this one doesn't say, so it's positive. So these two signs were different, so we get a negative. And so I'll put a negative right in front of that 3, and our result is negative 3. Okay? Now, to do this on your calculator, you've got options. For today, I'm going to show you the one that I think most students like the best, and that is we're going to do this in 3 steps. So I'm going to switch to red pen, and I'm going to show you the 3 steps that I would take. I would start by drawing a fraction, a small one, and I'm going to take my calculator, and I am going to type just what I see in the numerator. Okay, so let's see. I think I turned my calculator off. Turned it on, hit clear, and so I'm going to go down the line. Now, I just covered up PEMDAS, the rules. It's not a big deal. Your calculator knows them. So I'm just worrying about the top. I'm not going to hit equals till I get to the end of the numerator. So 81 plus, open parentheses. This is not a subtraction. This is a negative 36, so I'm going to use that button that's way at the bottom here. If you can't see, let me exaggerate it more. Coming down below 9, below 6, below 3, all the way down here, I'm going to press this negative button. And it's negative 36. Close the parentheses. That's how far I am. And I'm going to hit divided by 6. That's the division button. And I hit 6. Before I hit equals, I'm going to tilt this a little bit so you can see it. See the display. Notice it's showing me like a /6, like a fractional version. That's just how it shows the division symbol on my calculator. But it's still it's still the right expression. So we kind of mimic the top, and I'm going to press equals, and I get 75, which shouldn't surprise us. It's what we got before. But in this red path over here, this is my calculator path. I'm thinking about the calculator. Oops, calculator. The calculator steps puts a 75 on top. And not surprisingly, I'm going to do the bottom now, and we better get a negative 25, but let's go ahead and see. 4 parentheses. I will mention, not all of you have this calculator. This calculator knows that if I type 4 in parentheses without typing the times, it knows it's multiplication. If you're using a different calculator, make sure that you know whether or not you have to type the times or not, because some calculators require it. A few of you who do not have this calculator, I've sent a link to an online calculator, and that one actually is a compromise. If you type 4 in parentheses on that online calculator, it lets you do it as a multiplication, but it actually still will type the multiplication on the screen. So when you do that, it reminds you that that means multiplication. If there's any others of you that don't have a decent calculator, I found one online that's free. Obviously, it's online, so it's a little bit of a pain, but it works fairly close to this one, but not perfectly. I strongly suggest that you still try to hunt one of these down, and let me know if that's a problem. But we'll do that one-on-one in email. So let's continue. So we were in the middle of typing this 4 parentheses, and now I'm going to type negative 5, which means I have to type that button all the way at the bottom. Negative 5. So that was this to get the negative, and then close the parentheses. And what comes next? Now it's minus 5. Even though the symbols look the same, this is saying it's a negative 5. This is ending with a subtraction. So I'm going to subtract 5. I hit equals, and it gives me a negative 25. Hopefully you can see that. And now what I'm going to do is my calculator doesn't like negatives in the denominator. if I type on my calculator 75 and then the ABC button, the fraction button, and then negative 25, it gives me an error. It's just not smart enough to figure this out. So that's where our rules for signed numbers would help. If I take care of the negative myself and say, oh, well, that's a negative, then I could do 75 ABC 3, or divided by 3. It'll do it either way. Oh, I said 3. I was anticipating the answer. 75 divided by 25. So I'll do that with the fraction button. 75 ABC 25, and that's negative 3. Okay, you get the same answer with the calculator. I did almost all the heavy lifting with the calculator when I switched to red pen over here. Here I tried to do it without the calculator, and we get the same answer. So you can kind of decide. One last tip for those of you who want to give it a shot. If you start this question over and want to do it in one big step, you could type open parentheses, type all of this like we did, but instead of hitting equal, you type close parentheses, and then your division button, and then open parentheses, all the denominator, close parentheses, and then finally hit equals. So you don't hit equals in between, you just treat it as parentheses divided by parentheses, and type that stuff the same, and it'll spit out the negative 3. I find that breaking it up into the two separate steps is best for 99% of students. So that's how I will show it if I'm helping you out. Okay? Any questions? Okay, next. They're just going to make it worse, but it's the same stuff. It's the same thing that you've been working on if you're up to date in homework 5. So again, let me write, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. I'll circle the 4 steps carefully. If any of you are not following why there's 6 letters and 4 steps as part of the rules, you want to refer back to the notebook or earlier in one of the videos, or just shoot me an email. Okay, so let's go ahead and do it. Parentheses. This one has what we call nested grouping symbols. We have grouping symbols within grouping symbols. This main one here, these brackets that are kind of square, that start and end, that says we start here, but since there's parentheses inside these parentheses, we have to start in the innermost. And we have 2 different cases here. The negative 7 parentheses, there's nothing to do in there. So for that, in regards to that one, step 1 would be done. But this one, 5 minus 9, is a parentheses. It's a grouping symbol that's nested within other grouping symbols. So we start at the innermost. And so let me go ahead and write that. Negative 3 squared minus 2. Notice I'm not doing anything else. I'm going to leave that parentheses blank for a second. But if you look at what I just wrote compared to what's above, all I did was prepare myself to do the 5 minus 9. And I'm going to do it again without a calculator. 5 minus 9 is going to be negative 4. It's negative 4, and there's a few ways to think about it. If you think of money, if I have $5 in my checking account and I subtract, I write a check for $9, I'm going to be $4 short. I just bounced a check. If it's 5 degrees outside and it gets 9 degrees colder. So if it was 5 above, it gets colder, it's now 4 below. Okay, any questions with that? Okay. This is a question that can be a little challenging, and which is why you'll also want to have a calculator that's going to help you double check these. But the next thing we're going to do is exponents. And so I'm going to write the minus 2 and all of this stuff because we're not ready to do it. And I'm going to take care of this exponent. Now here's where if you missed last class, we talked about if you have a negative 3 squared, the only time that this 2 is squaring a negative The only time that this exponent is talking about the sign is if this thing is in parentheses. Because it's not, the negative is not being squared. If the negative is squared, like we had in an earlier example, that's a negative times a negative, which gives us a positive according to our rules. But this negative is not being squared, only the 3 is. 3 squared is 9, so this is going to result in a negative 9. The 2 was talking about the 3, and 3 squared is 9. Without parentheses, this 2 is not talking about the negative, and so the negative survives. Okay? Now, it might feel tempting to take care of this negative 9 minus 2 that's out in front, but this is a multiplication here between the two, this 2 and the bracket is a multiplication, and multiplication comes in an earlier step than subtraction, so hold off and do everything according to the order of operations. So we're still kind of on the parentheses step. We worked inside this one. Then we moved on to the exponent step and did that, but we still have to work with inside this parentheses. And so, negative 9 minus the 2. I actually cheated a little bit and did this one out of order. It's not going to cost me because it's not inside the parentheses. I really should have held off on this and waited until I completely exhausted the parentheses step. Maybe I'll eventually redo this one, but for now I'm just going to continue because the stuff I say about inside the parentheses is the same as what we were talking about. And so there's no exponents inside the parentheses, so I'm on the multiplication division step. 3 times negative 7 is negative 21. You're multiplying, so you just do the multiplication. 3 times 7 is 21. A positive times a negative is a negative. And then negative 7 times negative 4 is a negative times a positive. A negative times a negative. Since they're the same, we get a positive. If this is making your head spin, 2 tips. Tip number 1, have your rules nearby for sign numbers, which I had a second ago. And the rules for multiplication talk about same or different. If you multiply different, you get a negative. If you multiply same, you get a positive. And then the rest of it, you just do the multiplication. 7 times 4 is 28. Okay? We'll hold off on the stuff that's out in front. And we'll finish off what's inside the parentheses. A negative 21 plus 28. If the signs are different, you subtract them. 28 minus 21 is 7. And then you decide if it's a positive 7 or a negative 7 based on which of these was bigger. Notice that with multiplication and division, it's not bigger, smaller. It's same or different. But with addition, I compare it to the mailbox again. If I go to my mailbox and I have a Visa bill for $21 and a paycheck for $28, I'm going to end up with a plus 7. The bigger sign wins out. Okay? Still a couple of steps left on number 16. And what we have left, there's a subtraction and there's a multiplication. And multiplication division step comes next. So I'm going to leave the negative 9 there for a second. Negative 2 times a positive 7 is going to give me some kind of a 14. The rule for multiplying sign numbers just says multiply, so you get a 14. And I'll put the 14, but I'll leave space for the sign. And a negative times a positive, when they're different, you get a negative. Okay? Finally, we can do negative 9 minus 14, and I believe that's going to be a minus 23. And here's why do I add them? I add them because they're pulling the same direction. It's 9 degrees below 0, and it gets 14 degrees colder. Now it's 23 below 0. Or if this was money, if I already owe $9 to Visa, and I pull that Visa card out again and spend another 14, my balance of $9 that I owe them, now I owe them even more. I owe them 23, so negative 23. And I know this wasn't a word problem, but I usually like to think about either temperature or money because those are the two applications that seem to make the most sense for people. And we got one more. Here it is, right at the bottom. This is lesson 6, but just like lesson 5, we said they sometimes add an algebraic step. And when they add an algebraic step, instead of giving us all numbers, they put some variables in here, the letters, and they tell us what they're worth, and we make the substitutions. So let's go ahead and do that. Up top, we have 3x minus 9y, so I'm going to write that as 3 parentheses minus 9 parentheses. And I'm going to fill in the parentheses with whatever they told me x and y are worth. Be careful that you grab them based on the variable. So if this is x, and x is negative 4, then I'm going to put the negative 4 in for x. And y is negative 2, so I'm going to put a negative 2 in where the y was. The bottom, we have a y squared, so I'm going to write that as parentheses squared, plus 2x, I'm going to write that as plus 2 parentheses. And again, you have to be careful. It's not first, second. It's how they line up by their variables. So y squared, this parentheses squared, I'm going to come over here and say y is negative 2. And this was 2x. The original was an x, and I'm replacing the x with x's value, which they said is negative 4. And so sticking that 4 inside there, and let me just kind of pause and take a sip of coffee while you look at that. Any questions while I'm grabbing some coffee? Okay. Next, PEMDAS. I'm going to treat this as 2 questions. I'm going to do the top, and the top, there's no parentheses or exponents. And I know, again, technically there's parentheses, but there's nothing to do inside the parentheses up top. So I'm on the exponent step, and there's no exponents. So now I'm going to do the multiplications. And notice I'm going to put a little red multiplication dot. There's a multiplication implied here, and there's a multiplication implied here. I just stuck 2 little red multiplication dots in there. You don't have to, but I just want our eyes to kind of see the multiplications take precedence over that subtraction in the middle. So I'm not going to do that subtraction yet. So 3 times negative 4. 3 times 4 is 12. A positive times a negative with different signs, you get a negative. And now back here, this one gets a little strange. You can think of it 2 different ways. You can think of it as subtracting 9 minus negative 2, subtracting 9 times negative 2 is negative 18. And so I'm going to write it like this. So that's negative 12 minus a minus 18. We're not going to talk about it a lot today, but when you have 2 signs, you can clean them up using your rules for multiplication. So if I have 2 negatives, that's a positive. In much the same way, if I say I'm not going to the store, then you'd expect me not to be at the store. If I use the word not twice, if I say I'm not going to the store, then I'm not going to the store. If I say I'm not going to the store, then that double negative would imply I am going to the store. I'm not going to the store. It's a little confusing in English, and it's a little confusing in math, but you have to get used to it. So some people would write this top as negative 12 plus 18. That's actually my favorite way to treat it. The double negative is a positive. To say it another way, if you had a Visa bill for $18 sitting on your counter, and I'm some kind of a Robin Hood criminal, and I come and I steal your Visa bill, so I have taken away your Visa bill, and as long as I pay for it, not just confuse your accounting records, but if I take a negative from you, that's the same as giving $18. If I say, hey, don't worry about that Visa bill, give it to me, I got it covered. So if I take your negative 18, I subtract a negative from you, that's like giving you a positive. If that makes sense, great. If not, don't worry about it. Notice I'm ignoring the bottom, and I'm going to now come down. I ran out of room going to the right, so I'm going to come down and write my fraction again. And a negative 12 plus 18 is a plus 6. The plus is optional to write. When it's a positive, you don't have to write it. And for reasons we stated before, but I'm going to let that one go for now, just for sake of time. And now we're going to look at the bottom. On the bottom, we look for anything to do inside parentheses, and there's nothing inside parentheses to do. So now I'm going to do exponents. this 2 is going to square the 2, which is 4, but because of the parentheses, you're also squaring the negative, and so that's a plus 4. To say it differently, in the original it was y squared, and this 2 told me to square y, so the reason I needed the parentheses, since the negative 2, the negative is part of the 2, part of y is negative 2, and I want to square y, I have to make sure I square all of that negative 2. And then the multiplication at this end, a positive times a negative is a negative, and 2 times 4 is 8. 4 minus 8 is negative 4. And if it's negative 4 there, then it finishes off as negative 4 down here. And then we have to decide how to simplify this. And I don't know if the directions say, but I'm going to just simplify it as a fraction. A positive divided by a negative, the signs are different, it's going to be a negative. And 6/4, I can either write that as 3 over 2, because I'm dividing the top and bottom each in half. That's one way to simplify a fraction. Or I could say this is negative 1 1/2.